I'm going to be a wanderer here a little bit, as some others have been. If I wander too close to the edge of the stage, try and wave your hands or do something like that so I don't fall off. And my talk is going to be a little bit different than some of the others that you heard yesterday. One of the things that I was asked to do was to provide some broader aspects of issues related to environmental monitoring, and also to ensure that we recognize that Emera itself is not only working with the oil sands, but the whole of Alberta. And in fact, I'll make the case that it's got to think a lot about the rest of the world as well, because the rest of the world will be looking at Emera, I can tell you, in great detail and wondering what it's doing. This is going to be, assuming that the kinds of monies that were discussed yesterday by the chair of the board, is going to be one of the biggest organizations in Canada to engage in environmental monitoring, if you just take the expenditure of money as the benchmark. And secondly, it's going to be something that the rest of the world is going to be looking towards and really investigating rather carefully about its findings. And so it's going to have to be able to not only be independent, but to be strongly defending what it finds, not only within the boundaries of Alberta or even Canada, but with the rest of the world. So in my own view of things, environmental monitoring is an extremely important part of the overall aspect of environmental management. I've always felt that way, and I consider myself from just being a young kid at one point in time in my life. I wish I could go back to that sometimes, but I always had this thing about environment and about water. As you'll see, I'm an aquatic ecologist by training, and that does tend to come through. I tend to favor things that relate back to water. But I'd start by saying that the ideal introduction to my talk today was what the board chair said yesterday morning. I agreed with pretty much every word that he spoke, and I think there were very important signals about how he feels that Emera should proceed, and I presume the whole board would feel that way as well. And I think this is very important, that we understand this broad task that is faced by this organization. And what I would like to do is give some insights that I have that I think will be helpful to the oil sands monitoring as one of the key starting elements of Emera, but I think is going to also inform the broader ways of thinking about environmental monitoring. And therefore, I have put my subtitle that Environmental Monitoring, a Key Asset for Sustainable Development. And keep your mind focused on key asset, because this is something I'm going to be coming back to as I speak. Now, I also deliberately chose this photograph, which I didn't take myself. It was by Karen Kidd, who works in the Experimental Lakes area in Ontario, and she's from the University of New Brunswick. Now, the point here is that we heard a lot about the shiny and glittery tools that are necessary to do modern environmental monitoring, but we also have to think of the tool that sits up inside here, and that often what appear to be simple methods, dumping a chemical in from the side of a boat in this experimental lake photo, can lead to a really useful set of insights. Now, I will just grab my little device here, which works very nicely. And I'd like to just point out, as I go through, I'm going to bring forth photos of what I consider some of the pioneers in this whole business of monitoring, by no means the only ones, David Schindler being one, who was very influential with the Experimental Lakes area, and now, of course, has been in the University of Alberta for a long time. And I'm very proud to say that the organization that I've been affiliated with for a number of years, since the early 90s, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, has now taken this over. But you can see from this list, and don't go into any detail, of course, on any of it, but there's a long list of accomplishments of what were really, in concept, quite simple experiments using the experimental lake area as a device to tell us about acidification, tell us about things like Karen Kidd is working on now, the impacts of estrogens when put into a lake, and then do certain things with fish populations, heavy metal contamination, etc. And in the future is going to do much more. And I think the important point here is as we go ahead with environmental monitoring, remember that it's how we put the pieces together. What are the missing pieces? Where do we and how do we come to these integrative approaches? How do we look at the role of experimental work, which is a research activity, with monitoring programs? Research and monitoring are related but sometimes different points of view. We heard a lot yesterday about the potential role of traditional ecological knowledge, yet I didn't see that reflected very clearly in the presentations that were made yesterday about how that can actually be used. For example, with the struggle to look at baseline considerations in the oil sands area, why not draw upon the traditional ecological knowledge to go back not just 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, but thousands of years? And how do we do that? We don't know very well. The absence of social sciences. If I were thinking of how to put together monitoring programs, I would want to have an ecological anthropologist and maybe an archaeologist working with some of the physical scientists to be able to try and understand certain features that are not very understandable about things from just monitoring air, water, and so forth by conventional scientific means. So these are some of the points that I'll be touching on in this talk. I'm going to give a set of conclusions, and I normally don't like giving conclusions without much evidence, but for time reasons I have to. But these are some, what I consider I've learned over the years as conclusions drawn from many different sources. And one is that monitoring is the foundation for research policy decisions and understanding long-term change. And this is all about long-term change. Trends aren't 5 years. Trends aren't 20 years. Trends are what we know in the longer term. And it's going to be very important for organizations like AMERIT to be able to develop that kind of perspective. It's also very important to continuously make the case that independent monitoring is a key asset for sustainability. You can't wait for governments to come along and say, yeah, we set up AMERIT for this reason, but you got to keep reminding and showing by example how it is a key asset. Otherwise, the money won't be there. The storyline in Canada about what happens to monitoring programs is a pretty ugly sight, and I could give many examples of that, including the one of the experimental lakes, which was barely rescued. I also, when I give talks like this, I'm giving these talks not for me, not for you guys, but for our grandkids. Not our kids, our grandkids. Our kids are already shaped, more or less, for many of us. But the grandkids have expectations. So I actually collaborated with particularly with my grandson, who's 7 years old, about some of the things that I might present. And when I showed him the actual presentation, I put some of that in. He's absolutely thrilled. And so you'll understand when I come a little bit further down what I mean. But the important point is that those grandkids will be up there having put their career more or less behind them, although we don't know when we retire in this business. Most people that deal with environment die with their boots on, that I've found, and hopefully at a ripe old age. But minimally, we have to think about the next 50 years ahead. It's actually much more than that. And we have to think in terms that are not so commonly used right now, but were used during the 90s and into the before and a bit after that, but state of the environment. What does the future look like for 2065? That should be on the minds of everybody in this room as you're thinking forward to the kinds of monitoring that has to be done. It's one thing to say, and we can talk about the oil sands, because I really enjoyed the presentations yesterday, by the way. There's an awful lot of exchange of information. But we're looking at it, in a sense, from the present. And what we have to do is look to the future and then backcast and think about it. So it may be that whether it's mercury or whether it's something else, we're having a good discussion about mercury this morning at the breakfast table here. If it's an expanded oil sands, what would that look like in 2065? And the levels, the loading into the environment, and the capacity of the environment to absorb it. So it's the long-term understanding of change. It's identifying key questions linked to trends. And there was a lot of discussion yesterday about some key questions, but what's the overarching bigger picture of the key questions? Not only for the oil sands, but for Alberta in general. The United States EPA, a number of years ago, had identified 23 key questions, what they considered key questions, that informed their state of the environment for the whole of the United States. So I don't know what those key questions would be. I have some ideas about that. But for Alberta to start thinking about this beyond where it has already, and for AMERA to start thinking about it, and in your own work, then linking back to those key questions. And of course, they can be linked to trends. How does the work relate to indicator standards and compliance? Didn't hear much about compliance yesterday, some, but the whole point about monitoring is that it relates in very, very significant ways to all three of those points. And the programs have to be tailored very much to that. Uncertainty, that was discussed yesterday afternoon particularly. Uncertainty, we have to avoid the hubris that we actually know what we're doing. And that's something I'll pick up as a theme later. And we also have to benchmark not just with Alberta, but with the rest of the world. This is the Three Gorges Dam. And I was asked a number of years ago by somebody of some significance in Western Canada, and he had brought a group of Chinese over, and I had not known until he asked me the question, Art, what should we tell the Chinese about the oil sands development? Because they were interested, and China's very interested in this, as you know. And I thought for a minute, well, think about it in the context of the Three Gorges Dam. You know, focus of world attention, much of it negative. Impacts will take decades to fully understand and address. The person that I work most closely with in China has a team of 200 scientists right now, drawn from their academies and universities, providing insights into what has actually happened since the dam was built, and presenting that to the President, to the Congress of China, the State Council, and others of China. And it's controversial nationally as well, and locally in China. There's a lot of people feel badly impacted by it and worries about all sorts of different things. So that's the context of oil sands. That's the context of monitoring and really trying to understand what's going on. People won't know for many years actually what's going on because it's that complex. So Three Gorges Reservoir, if we compare size-wise, number 28 in world size by stored water volume. The reservoir in BC associated with the big power dam in British Columbia, which of course directly comes in, and there's a whole long story, a long history of when that dam was built. Virtually no downstream monitoring took place until it was discovered that the delta region was drying up. And so I don't think that could quite happen now, but I would suggest that with the dam construction, and I know Alberta's active in this, that's taking place in BC is going to significantly impact upon any kind of monitoring of the water systems in Alberta, and then outside of Alberta up into the Northwest Territories. But the important point I'm trying to make here is that if we're comparing, and I don't really like doing this, but it's an interesting comparison, the largest dams in the world by volume of structure, if you go and look that up, the actual physical structure, is actually the Syncrude tailings dam. Mildred MLSB is number 1, and SWSS is number 3. That kind of struck me as being, wow. and so there's no way that you can't take those kinds of considerations into account. So the conclusion is that the interest in the quality and results of Alberta's environmental monitoring is worldwide. You've got to just take that as a given. That the range of legitimate stakeholders even is very large and influential. And they will compare Alberta's performance with monitoring and assessment elsewhere. Also very important. And so you can expect expert-driven, long-term scrutiny of the environmental monitoring that will take place here. So that means that, first of all, the data have to be comparable. That, secondly, the data have to be credible. And thirdly, you're going to get a lot of noise which you're not going to like about it. So you've got to be prepared to defend and so forth on those points. By the way, these background pieces I put in these concluding slides are from different spots in Banff where I've photographed. And I think that's one of the gems, of course, of Alberta. and it's very relevant to this whole discussion of environmental monitoring. So for me, it's pretty simple to say that Alberta's water monitoring is the most critical component overall of programs of monitoring. And I take the example of the Columbia ice field, which you would all know, I think, and this notion that this is one of the few places in the world that has a hydrological apex where the water goes in very different directions. And without too much, this is where I live in right now in Victoria, on the top on the Pacific coast, the Atlantic coast, Lunenburg area, and the Arctic, the ice roads up there near Tuktoyaktuk. So the basic point is that what happens in Alberta, even though it's a landlocked province, influences three oceans, the three oceans of Canada. And we can't lose sight of that kind of thing in monitoring. Next one, I don't know. I'm just curious. This is for my own benefit here. Planetary boundaries. How many of you, if you could raise your hand, how many of you have thought about or heard about the work that's going on? It's actually started in Sweden by a person named Johan Rockström, about planetary boundaries. Not very many. Read it, because it's important. So what this group, and they've published in Nature, Science, and many other articles, is on trying to define what can be a safe operating space for humanity. I think this is very important in our consideration of monitoring programs. This is a global monitoring program, but it comes right back down because the globe is comprised of basically places everywhere on the planet: water, air, and of course land areas. They have, I'm not going to go into details on this, but they have looked at what they consider to be 9 key planetary boundaries. I'm not going to go through them in any detail, but you can see that the feeling is that where the red zones are, that we've exceeded some of those boundaries. The yellow is areas where we're getting there, we're getting close, perhaps. So something like climate change, but in terms of biosphere integrity, which we were talking a lot about yesterday in the Alberta context of whether it's the caribou or genetic resources or anything else that all goes into that, ecological services, which I didn't hear that word used yesterday, and I was a bit surprised at that. But ecological services is part of biosphere integrity, and we've exceeded that on the planet. If you look at the work that's done by the World Wildlife Fund on ecological footprints, we know that. Biogeochemical factors, which is a key one. The cycling of phosphorus, the cycling of other nutrients, nitrogen, which is something that I work a lot with in China. Big problems. Anyways, think of the idea of planetary boundaries, read about it, and I hope it would come back to influence the work of organizations like Emera. So the conclusion here is that the Alberta monitoring investment can contribute to global, regional, and local understanding of planetary sustainability. At the same point in time, we can draw upon the monitoring insights from elsewhere to understand Alberta's trends. And that's very important. And again, this comes back to data compatibility. And what's really missing, and not just here, but everywhere in the world, is the capacity to develop the synoptic overview of what you're doing. And this is apparent here in the oil sands. It's early days yet on this, but there's scientists, there's the policymakers, there's people involved with traditional knowledge and others, and how do you bring this together in ways that is sensible and sensitive to the needs of information? And those needs are going to be growing and expanding. Now, it's my personal view that you need people beyond the scientists to do this. You need people that can lead the teams. And as was pointed out yesterday, and when you start getting to the idea of preparing recommendations, etc., you have to do this often on a co-management basis. And I think this is a very important matter. I'm just checking the time. Good, I'm doing okay here. Now, environmental points of view. And now, I learned a lot from a guy who's died in the 1970s, actually, Marston Bates, who was a very famous ecologist in the United States who happened to be at the University of Michigan, where I studied at that point in time. And he made this very simple observation, and it stuck with me over the years and reinforced the way I approach things. Think of environmental points of view as being perceptual, conceptual, and spiritual. And you could add some other words to that as well, and I will in a second. But those three particularly. Spiritual, that's where we get a lot of the thinking about traditional ecological matters and or knowledge, I should say. Conceptual, we heard a lot about yesterday, the kinds of models that we use, the ways we bring data together and put them into all those nice graphs and curves. Remember, they're not reality. Spiritual is not reality, but both become deeply held points of view that have to then be reconciled with perceptual. The simplest way I can think of perceptual is, I see the environment differently than a dog sees the environment. Or an eagle sees the environment that can spot something down in the snow running around on the ground. We all have our different ways of looking at things. Again, we think we know what the world looks like. The reality is none of us know what the world looks like really. And I can guarantee after 20 more years of the oil sands monitoring, you still won't know what the world looks like really. And even more so when you start putting the pieces together from other parts of Alberta. So we have to be humble in the face of what we think is our very refined knowledge base, and we have to be, what's the best term, respectful of the way other people and other institutions around the world, within our own setting, think about environmental points of view. I've learned this often the hard way by having what I thought was a good but sensible point of view. And I discovered, and the best way I can put it is, when somebody comes along and opens a new window on the problem, and that's something that you always have to be prepared to do, is find somebody that may come from not a scientific background or not even a background that you think is very relevant, and they suddenly point to something and the aha moment has been reached. There's going to be lots of those aha moments, and they're going to be different because of the changing nature of the world. Climate change is going to introduce some of these points as well. If we come to this from a more operational perspective, industry, particularly in eco-efficiency programs and that of 90s and into the present time, if you can't measure it, it doesn't count. Well, I don't totally agree with that, but there is a strong point of view there that has to be respected. And so measurement becomes very important. But whose measurement? Under what conditions is it measured? Under what conditions are things left out of the measures because it's inconvenient to do so? The example yesterday from Environment Canada of taking this much data and crunching it down and crunching it down and eliminating, so you're down to 4 variables or something like that. There's some dangers in that. We always have to do it, but there's dangers. And there's particularly dangers if it's done by one discipline without another discipline coming in saying, but wait, that's important for this reason. So measurement is a double, many-edged sword, actually. Precautionary approach or precautionary principle. How do you avoid what I call options for closure? So in other words, if you say something rather authoritatively, are you eliminating options of future use, for example, or creating greater rather than lesser risks for some reasons that maybe you don't understand well yourself? The precautionary approach is an important one. I think it's losing grounds these days, actually, rather than, as it was introduced in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, becoming something that's of greater and greater significance. And I think it should be very important to understand option for closure and reducing risks. And then there's the third one, which is easy to say, but change is the only constant. We hear this often. But we actually have to understand what are the real rates of change that are going on. And I think that the efforts were rather noble in the face of the short data sets that are available often for this oil sands. But we have to understand that change is happening constantly, and it's going to impact how we should be thinking about monitoring. And even the drivers are going to be different at various times. I think of the nasty situation related to climate change of the forest pine bark beetle in British Columbia, which is now coming into Alberta, what that can do to change the forest industry of this province, and therefore the hydrology of the province, as we're finding in BC already. So I lived for a long time on the East Coast, and we actually still have a property there, and it's exactly the same thing happening on our property. The old spruce trees and the medium-aged spruce trees are dying. and it's a spruce bark beetle because of the warming winters. And in Manitoba, I'm told it's the larch bark beetle. You know, so these are big drivers that we didn't think very much about 10 or 20 years ago. Now coming to grandkids. What do you see here? We often talk about the forests and the trees. So we see trees, and maybe we could see it as forests. This comes from something, a book that my grandson has been reading, Illusions. Well, actually, what's there, if you look closely, there's a camel, there's a pig, there's a horse, there's a deer, and the elephants, cow, and squirrel. Now, I looked at that picture of the trees for about 2 minutes, and I could not see. And I'm saying, what? That's just trees. I don't see anything else. And then suddenly, when it was explained, well, look at the camel up in the corner. And suddenly, a whole different image popped up in my. And now, if I look at that diagram, I automatically go to see the animals before I see the trees. So the point about perception here, and what do we actually see? And that was an aha moment. But there's many of those. And here's an example that from each of our coasts, gyres and eddies. If I ever get around, as I'd like to do, of writing a book about Canada's oceans, I would start with chapter 1 being gyres and eddies, because we didn't see these things until we had satellite imagery. You can see on the only one I'll really show in detail is the Haida eddy here, and this is off the west coast of Canada. It's an incredibly important part of things, because those eddies are actually transporting young larvae out to the offshore where there's underwater mountains and things like that, and it is transporting the nutrient flow, and it's driven by the red, which is the freshwater input from Skeena River and a whole bunch of rivers. And so you have something that's created by the rotation of the Earth and the water characteristics that's vital to the understanding of the ecology of the West Coast. Similarly, on the Gulf Stream, there's big rings that come off on the East Coast. These, the data were actually, the monitoring data were actually, whenever they'd find these rings, which are warm water rings in a cold water system, they would eliminate the data. And I think it was Woods Hole that actually stopped the research vessels when they discovered these rings and took them back, because they said they were wasting their time. They were not getting the right data. And it was absolutely vital data for the survival of young cod, spawn from scallops coming up from the bottom. If they hit one of these rings, when they came up, everything died. And so the important point is that we tend to eliminate the things that we're uncertain of, and we just put them as errors. And those are the things that are really driving the system. These Haida eddies were really discovered pretty much by some guy who was a geek sitting in a basement somewhere in Ohio or somewhere like that, who just liked observing satellite imagery. And so he started wondering what these were, and phoning and talking eventually with the oceanographers, who then put the pieces together. So think about these matters, that a focus on data gathering without understanding differing perspectives may cause poor communication of the results, incorrect interpretations, play into the lack of trust that often occurs between agencies, and a whole bunch of other undesirable outcomes. So we have to think very carefully to move beyond data gathering to how we select amongst that data, and of course how we put the pieces together. And this brings me to the important point about scientific storylines. We, as scientists, tend to get immersed in our storylines. Sometimes we can't even tell them very clearly to the rest of the world. We know too much, and we sometimes can't figure out how to just put it together, or we're overwhelmed by data. Monitoring data can accumulate very rapidly, and then it has limited value, though, unless translated into insightful conclusions and choices, policies. So there's the policymakers over here, the scientists there, other people, and what's the intermediary look like? I don't expect scientists to be able to put all of that together. And I'm just saying, from my own point of view, very early on, I decided that I would be sitting in the middle. It's a very uncomfortable position to be in, by the way, but it's very exciting, because you learn. My classic story is one time I lived in Indonesia for quite a while, and I was working with some very good scientists, and we were working on a very important issue. And so I had these interdisciplinary teams. Well, the soil scientist felt that the only way to go ahead on this was for him to have 90% of the money to be able to fully explore the soils. And he made a strong case for that. I had to make an equally strong case, but one that was a good one, not offending him, that had to recognize that I only needed 10% of his knowledge to assemble, and furthermore, I had to be the one that chose that knowledge, more or less, after listening to him. And this is often the case with scientific information. The people that assemble it and then present it to the policymakers or putting into a report on monitoring, etc., have to be very judicious in how they approach the scientific storylines. And that's not to denigrate the science. It's to say that there's a bigger set of concerns that always have to be addressed. And one has to have the scientists working with the information from the beginning, work with the end users so that you can understand perspectives and to some extent tailor what is even monitored, and then you bring that forward. But then you have to kind of draw upon these specialized analytical and communication skills to get the final products out. And I would say finally that in today's society, and particularly in resource-oriented provinces like Alberta, storylines that cannot link environmental science with traditional knowledge or that ignore some of the other key components is quite likely to be rejected at the end of the day, even if it's good. And I'd say that when we talk about traditional knowledge, we can be talking about First Nations knowledge, but we can equally sometimes be talking about community-based knowledge. The ranchers and the people, the example yesterday resonated with me of, why do people put cattle close to creeks and let them wallow around and create messes for everybody, including the cattle, because the water is contaminated? I've gone to farms that don't do that, and it's remarkable how much better off they are. So what I consider that we also have to think about what I call virtuous loops. How do you use information? The initial environmental monitoring, which can be very extensive, then becomes the basis for standards. Then you have to have follow-up monitoring of the results, regional air quality being a prime example, but water issues as well. EIAs that are followed up by, because often what happens is that there's a huge effort goes into developing the knowledge base around an EIA. Is there the necessary monitoring to make sure that what's stated in the environmental impact assessment and the commitments are actually followed up on? The answer frequently is no. New research hypotheses emerge out of environmental monitoring, and these can be then used to confirm or sometimes reject the monitoring results through experimentation or further monitoring. I'd say that's the example of the experimental lakes. One of the big things, and it was mentioned yesterday, but very inconclusively, I think in Canada we don't do a very good job about cumulative impact assessment. I felt that I chaired for Environment Canada many years ago some work on environmental impact assessment approaches, the science approach and so forth, and the social science approach. By far the most difficult problem was always when you started using the words cumulative impact assessment. The issues of attribution, scale, timing, external influences, influences that are coming from outside of your area, for example, the Williston reservoir example, and then the interactions among impacts. We just don't know. And this is something that I think has to be tackled, and Emera may be in a good position to help with this, but not only by Emera, to actually understand these cumulative impact effects, because they're going to get more and more important. We're piling development on top of the development, and if we think of what Alberta or BC or any of the provinces will have development by, let's say, that 2065 period compared to now, wow, it's going to be a different place. Another thing that was mentioned yesterday, but somewhat inconclusively, but it's very important, is as part of the storylines, I've found that scenario development can be very, very useful in reporting and monitoring results. And there's all sorts of techniques. There's outlooks you can do, foresight, forecasting techniques of one sort or another. And they have to be data-informed models, essentially. And some of these can be word models. They don't all have to be, they may be a lot of information that comes out of these things is really options that are based on a lot of modeling, but it's putting the model pieces together that's important. And examining, as I said at the beginning of this talk, long-term consequences of potential decisions, very important. So the conclusion here is that monitoring does not stop with data gathering and analysis. That's only the beginning. The scientists and others must develop very sophisticated, tailored, integrative means to ensure that information is turned into useful insights, new models, and research hypotheses. It's easy to say that. It's much harder to do it. Now, I'm getting on here, and I'm trying to race through. Monitoring has an institutional component, of course, and there's various ways of looking at this. Again, I'm drawing upon my 7-year-old's perspective. Fortunately, he's not involved with too many institutions other than school. But anyways, the missing pieces approach. If Amera comes in and is the right jigsaw piece, it brings together all these other institutions. And they're all jigsaw pieces as well. Reality, highly fragmented. And people don't talk to each other. They may hate each other. They may be suspicious of each other. They may be friends with each other. But how do you put together the pieces? And then after you take this jigsaw puzzle, you may find that, oh, they only sent me 75% of the pieces, and there's still some missing things. So this is the reality. And this is something that has to be worked on and can only be worked on situation by situation. And I would say, again, going back to this puzzle isn't even made anymore, I discovered. I went online to see if I could find it. And this is a 36-piece, 2-foot by 3-foot jigsaw puzzle of Canada, made in the United States, of course. But in any case, if I'm looking at the scale and connections issue, which is a big one, I would say that if Alberta is going to have a very major, significant impact in monitoring, that you have to have at least these number of pieces connected together, because it's British Columbia doing things to you, you doing things through the hydrological apex region back to British Columbia and the Columbia River, up into the up into the Northwest Territories, of course, through the Mackenzie system. And then I lived in Manitoba for a long time, in the Assiniboine River, which comes from the foothills of the Rockies and that, and flows all the way across the prairies. And I was astonished at the poor quality of data when I first moved there. It's improved since, about what was actually happening to that river by the time it reached Manitoba and by our house, and then eventually up into Lake Winnipeg. So, and then north from there, out to the Hudson Bay region, eventually through other rivers. So these kinds of connections you can't ignore, and yet they can't overwhelm you. And you, again, going back to what I said originally, there's a need to keep that perspective that Alberta is connected to other places, and within Alberta, there's a lot of connections, often via water. So it's essential to develop and maintain the interest of important end users and monitoring partners. Those monitoring partners are going to be all over the place. That we need a fine-grained and a coarse-grained approach to it. So you got to think big, and you got to think down small into local watersheds, etc. Regional connections are essential, and we need a robust strategy to reach out to some of the parties that are poorly informed, disinterested, or hostile. I'll leave that for you guys to untangle, but we've got to think about all of those groups. I want to just move very quickly to the idea of adaptive planning and assessment. The notions of ecological and social resilience are tied into some of the thinking about the storylines surrounding monitoring. Tipping points and turning points. Tipping points where things suddenly go bad. Turning points when you're trying to get something to go back and you don't know whether you're making it or not. Monitoring is very important. Emerging issues, new issues, surprises, and as I said already, an option for closure. You have to put this in a context. I won't go into detail on this, but Dr. Halling is a great producer of ideas on this and has basically guided my career for many years. And that is that there's an adaptive cycle. The world is not linear. People think in different ways. There's points in time when there's denial. There's points in time where there's an eagerness to move ahead very quickly. Monitoring can help in that curve very much. I won't go into more detail on that. Integrated monitoring, we talked a bit about that yesterday. And this goes back to what I call ecosystem integrity, ecosystem services, and we heard a lot yesterday about ecological restoration. If I were restarting my career now, I would become an ecological restoration person. I think that's vitally important. One of the things that's totally missing yesterday, and I don't think should be completely, is the ecological economic relationship. You need economists to be thinking about the use of ecological and environmental monitoring materials. And then this other one, which was discussed in a bit, but not that much detail, sublethal interactive dose response effects. Very, very important. Monitoring timeframes. So TEK is information passed on over thousands of years, not hundreds of years, and that's one of the important things that can really make it useful. I think of many programs it's mandated. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which runs out of Ontario but is really national in its scope to some extent, talks about wherever we store our long-term waste, there has to be an initial monitoring program guaranteed for 100 years, probably 1,000 years, but they'll let future generations take care of that. 30 plus to 50 years plus, and it's really going to be 30 to 100 years in my view, is very important. The Great Lakes, I think, are one of the finest examples of environmental monitoring in North America. And the Great Lakes Water Agreement, which has been going since 1972, is a really good example. But then we have these other matters, the follow-up to EIAs, the integrated resource management, which really, you can take shorter periods, but recognizing there has to be continuous efforts for many years for environmental monitoring to be sensible. I would suggest that you take a look at this report of the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, 2011, Chapter 5, A Study of Environmental Monitoring in Canada. And one of the points they make in that, there's some very useful scientific points of view, but that the federal government spends $500 million a year on environmental monitoring. And now, if we look at the figures for what Emera proposes, it's going to be significant in comparison to what the rest of the federal government spends, and basically would make it one of the largest ones in Canada. So how do you get the best value and the best practices that can emerge out of that expenditure? What makes then, this is my final slide coming up, what makes environmental monitoring a key asset for sustainable development? Well, it's some combination of all the things that I've mentioned, but these are the things that jump out for me always and keep in mind. First of all is credibility and trust in the findings. Now, I was very happy to hear that word trust used by so many speakers yesterday. If you don't have trust, you don't have a credible monitoring program, no matter how good your science. So building trust, building relationships, continuous continuity of dialogue is absolutely essential. The interpretive capacity is still weak. I say that not just about what Alberta is starting on this long pathway, but now with a lot of background on it, but still in Canada and still really elsewhere in the world, interpretive capacity of environmental monitoring is still a weak point. It needs to be enhanced, and enhanced perhaps differently than it has in the past. And the whole point of this is it's going to be successful if you can actually identify better choices and then make those choices. Now, that's not all on the back of the monitors, the environmental monitors. It's on the backs of the policymakers at the end of the day, but there's a huge amount of hand-holding, dialogue, and interpretation that's necessary to get there. And then ultimately, better sustainability outcomes as a result. But it's also very, very significant that the public has to feel confident in the kind of monitoring that they're getting. There's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of distrust about science, as we know. And that's increased dramatically over the last decade. And the vaccines discussions that are going on now is an example of that, but there's many others that relate to the environment. And so building that public understanding has got to be a key task, and communications for an organization like Emera and some of the others, this is extremely important. continuity of long-term monitoring mandate and funds has to be assured. It's not guaranteed. Let me tell you, it's not guaranteed right now. This is one of the problems that has befallen so many good monitoring programs around the world. Governments get tired of them. Sometimes there's hostile reactions to the truths that they're trying to bring out. There's all sorts of reasons, budget cuts and so forth. Vulnerability is high. And so therefore, there has to be this continuity of dialogue that's going on, and there should be no sense of either smugness or, and I'm not saying Amera or any organization necessarily has this, but it may be perceived that these are ivory tower institutions, that they're not worth the immense amount of money. There's all sorts of better ways of spending that money. So that's got to be a very, very earned kind of position for the organization to be able to meet its full potential. So I'll stop here and just say thank you. And I really enjoyed being invited to come to this meeting. I learned a lot yesterday, and I wish everybody that's involved with the oil monitoring, oil sands monitoring, great success in their future work. I hope this talk will help to contribute a bit to that. And I think Alberta is making a very wise decision in setting up a monitoring agency that is province-wide and would have implications not only for this province, but for the rest of Canada and for the world. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Sure.
We do have a few minutes for a question or two, if anybody was interested. I see a few people milling around. They're coming in from the meals. Anyone? All right, good. Well, thank you. That was a great start today. We really appreciate it. You are going to stay around?
Oh, yes.
Yes,
right.
so he is going to stay around if you wanted to talk. And oh, sorry, there was somebody coming to the mic there. I'm sorry. Yep, please.
My name is Dr. Wahab, and I worked at SRD. And yesterday I was here throughout. I was more than confused about the old science ideas of what they are doing. And I actually came in late for your presentation. What interests me about your presentation is you talk about conceptual, spiritual. Then the next thing myself, I put down operationalization. And you actually came to that. See, why I was confused yesterday was about your data they are collecting. I'm a planner, I'm a regional planner. How do I take those data and operationalize them on the ground? So yesterday, all the presentations were very good. All the scientists, they are well known, but the bridge, the link between operation and scientists were lacking. So how do we marry them? Well, the social scientists were annihilated yesterday. Nobody mentioned anything about natural science. Nobody mentioned anything about social science. So this morning, I'm more than happy to hear from you talking about social scientists, natural science, and physical science. So for me, how can we as a planners take those materials and use them on the ground?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot. My view is that the regional planners are one of the key intermediaries in this process. Because, first of all, your scope goes beyond the really fine-grained. It's kind of medium-grained, you know, where you're looking at a lot of different impacts, drivers, and outcomes, and they all have to be kind of brought together. So my sense of it is that the regional planners can work closely with the scientists to understand them, and it's also very important for the scientists, therefore, to be bringing their findings out in a way that can best represent the needs of the regional planners. But the regional planners themselves are not necessarily the policymakers. They, in turn, are going to present their ideas to people who will make decisions. So I view you as being in that intermediary role. And it's a difficult one, always difficult. It means that you have to be able to stretch your thinking to be able to understand what the scientists are telling you. And if they are telling you in a way that is not intelligible for your needs, then you need to be pressing them for that information presented in a way that you can understand and can use. That's the blunt answer. And at the other end of it, you should be able to then translate that information in a way that does bring together the economic, the social, and then put it in a form that is really oriented towards sustainable development and the sustainability concerns that would be transmitted to the policymakers who may have to turn that into funded programs, into laws, and so forth. So you're sitting in the middle. that's the one line answer. But it's really, really important. And particularly in the context of what AMERA wants to do, which is to work region by region by region within Alberta. One of the big problems is that AMERA will be perhaps looking at things either sectorally, like the farming sector or something like that, or they'll be looking at by ecological regions that may not conform exactly to those straight lines that are drawn around administrative regions. So but you're a vital intermediary in that whole process.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thanks.
Over there. Great.
I have one question. I was concerned that I got the impression that you thought that monitoring should be focused on regulations, and I'm hoping that's not what you meant, because monitoring needs to lead to understanding so that you can manage properly, and regulations are usually the response to yesterday's problems, not to current problems or future ones. So how can you take the approach where you couple actually monitoring and research to be proactive, as well as being able to be synoptic as you're doing this?
Yes, well, certainly I don't want to leave the impression that monitoring is of regulations. I think the critical aspect of it is to ensure that you have a future perspective. In other words, you're thinking ahead of the curve as opposed to behind. On the other hand, the monitoring itself often has to deal with past problems, present problems, as well as thinking into the future. And so from that point of view, I always think of the legacy issues. Soil pollution, for example, is often in that category. But I think the important point is, again, it's the dialogue that is necessary to be established so that one comes out with a monitoring program that is highly relevant to today's needs, but goes beyond that, because monitoring has to deal with the issue of future surprises, which is often very difficult to figure out, but you can do that through trend lines in all sorts of different ways. I think the important point that has to be brought out is that monitoring provides you, this is why I used at the beginning, it's a sense of the state of the environment. It tells you about what's a reality out there now and what's likely to be coming down the line if you look at the trend lines. And then that can be used both to establish improved research goals, but it can also then be fed back into the decision makers so that they get a better sense of how to go about setting out their regulations or their laws or their funding programs. So it's kind of, as much as one likes to, except that it doesn't always work this way, it's trying to come with a sometimes uncomfortable set of truths that are important, that you can rely upon, though, that are credible and trusted about what's the actual situation and what's the future likely to be like as a consequence. There's one more.
Really appreciated your talk. Thank you very much for it. And I do agree that that translation piece, and in taking from the previous question, the linking between the regulatory piece and the monitoring piece is really important. And I think where we need to improve our understanding are the links between industry performance or operator performance and environmental performance. So for example, you could have an operator that's in compliance but environmental performance is going down. And that is an indication that maybe the directives and the regulations are not protective and require re-examination, which is a common occurrence that was employed through the Environmental Effects Monitoring Program, for example, in Canada. Or you could have a company that's out of compliance on a particular incident, yet environmental performance is unaffected, and that is an important comparison to get the context into that comparison. So that is another area that, you know, as we move into different groups being responsible for different components of this equation, AMERA monitoring, AERs on the regulatory side, improving that understanding of how we can use each other's data to really get to where we need to, I think is important. And I don't wonder if there are other places in the world where you've seen those links between industry performance and environmental performance effectively implemented through governance. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, yes, what I think we could perhaps talk about specific cases in that. I don't have time to do that now. But the quick answer is yes, there are cases. But let me take your general observation there, and I'd like to refine it very quickly into saying that compliance is not going to be enough, particularly if we are talking about this link of a key asset for sustainable development. And so I have a simple diagram that was actually produced by a fellow who's unfortunately no longer with us, named Jim Leslie from Alberta here. And that is that you think about when you're trying to achieve sustainable development, it's always kind of a holy grail up there somewhere, and always just slightly out of reach. And that's the way it has to be. But there's compliance-driven stuff, which is bare minimum, of course. Then there's risk assessment, which industry now takes very seriously, and which I think environmental monitoring can help a lot with defining those risks more clearly and defining which ways are not going to give you much, maybe because the risk isn't that significant, even though we may think it is, and point out some areas where the risk really is significant. And then there's the approach towards, which I think will the industry and the oil sands will have to move very rapidly towards, which is introducing sustainability kinds of oriented technologies, which would take you into where it's influencing the bottom line of the company, influencing the bottom line of governments, and in essence, being very cost effective, getting you into new territory. And we're seeing this in the automobile industry now as people are experimenting with electric automobiles and whatever, and we know how difficult it is. But there's a lot of this is not that difficult. It's just it hasn't happened. And so environmental monitoring has to be important for all three levels: compliance, risk, and then sustainability. And that's quite a curve. And everybody can enter that curve at some level, and some will move much more quickly than others in getting to where you want to go. And I think that's an important point. But I'll be happy to talk to you during the course of the day about specific examples. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very good. Thank you.